seize property and, for example, not report it to a court. Under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, if a police officer seizes property, it needs to be reported to a court. Section 8 of the Charter clearly governs it. I do a lot of work actually in the controlled drugs and substances field involving seizures with warrants and seizures from cars. It is nothing akin at all to what we're looking at in Bill C-6. Now, whether or not there are similar provisions in other pieces of legislation that I'm not aware of, that's very possible. I don't think that that removes from what this committee needs to consider the precedent that it sets. So let's say, just for argument's sake, that the Environmental Protection Act allows inspectors to seize property that might be covered under that act and never report it to a court, and that they can charge administratively and forfeit it to the Crown without ever a court even learning of the property. I would say that that would be very alarming and would be then an example of how, oh, well, this other agency has it, so why can't we? It's okay. Just as if this is the, let's say this is the first example and it passes, then, you know, is the next bureaucracy going to line up and say, well, Health Canada has it, is it okay? I'm here to say I've read this act. I'm very alarmed by its extremely broad scope, and I ask the question, is it necessary for us to protect ourselves from consumer products and allow the state to have such broad sweeping powers without court supervision? And you don't hear me knocking and saying consumer protection isn't necessary, or that there aren't some parts of this bill that I think actually could enhance consumer safety. It's just, you know, the question about having private property without limits seized, without any supervision. And I mean, I don't think we'd have to use much imagination to say, well, if I was, you know, a small business owner and it happened to me, where basically my livelihood and my providing for my family is in jeopardy, and I don't have any recourse, that most of us would find that really intolerable. And one of the dangers of allowing the state to have these types of powers is that those that are subject to those powers become alienated from the state, because the state becomes a complete adversary without any, you know, forum such as a court to resolve things. And, you know, the state does have an interest in consumer protection, but we have things like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Section 8, which guarantees everyone the right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure, to moderate how the state interacts with us. And, you know, if anyone wants to ask me about jurisdiction, I'm just anxious to talk about whether or not the federal government even has jurisdiction to pass this legislation because of its overall breadth.
Okay. Ms. Cherniak, I appreciate your analysis of what's good and what's bad protection. When Health Canada officials were here, they said that Bill C-6 is consistent with changes to product safety legislation in the United States and the European Union. Do you think that's true?
I'm going to be honest with you, I haven't looked at the EU provisions and I haven't looked at the US provisions. I've looked at this from a perspective as, is this consistent with Canada's international obligation and not criticizing another state's decisions. So when I looked at this particular bill as it's written, nothing jumps off the page saying that there is something that can go to the WTO tomorrow. But that being said, actions that get taken under this bill, I can see a lot of potential for bad protectionism and actions to be taken under this bill that will lead to disputes that either go to the WTO or to a NAFTA panel or another free trade agreement panel.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me go to my colleagues now, and we'll start with Senator Eaton, a senator from Toronto, Ontario.
Thank you, both witnesses. Very interesting. Mr. Buckley, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't understand the law as well as you do, so perhaps you could explain. I think you said, just in your last response to Senator Eggleton, that inspectors were exempted from the law of trespass. Could you explain that to me?
Yes, I can. And I believe it's subsection 20 sub 4. I'd have to look at the act. So, which just basically exempts them from liability for being on people's property. And the way the law of trespass just simply works is we've inherited from the English common law this...
A point of order, Mr. Chairman. I've understood that, on the contrary, inspectors are liable. They can be taken to court and be charged if they misuse their right of going on your property.
Well, a point of order.
They are subject to...
I think it's a point of order, but you clarified your question a little bit, and so Mr. Buckley can take it from there.
And I'm not actually quite sure that I'm following now the...
They could be charged. If somebody goes into, over a shopping mall, goes into your store, starts breaking apart your products, it was my understanding from Health Canada that they could be held responsible and, in fact, be charged if they misused their right of inspection.
Well, now that's interesting. It's just, as I say, when I look at section 20, subsection 4, the way I read that is that's exempting them and people accompanying them entering on or passing through private property. So just the way I'm reading that is that's basically exempting them from the law of trespass.
I think it's...
Doing so, the last few words of 20 subsection
They're not
4.
liable for crossing into a shopping mall, but that does not excuse them from behavior or not behaving according to the law.
I guess I have to, stick with my answer that I'm
So
first of all, it's not limited to shopping malls, and
well, stores or somebody's house, they need a warrant to go into somebody's private house. If they destroy or willfully do things that are not right according to this bill, they are subject to, could be charged.
the interesting thing actually about this subsection 24 is when you look at administrative law and administrative law cases, courts have been very clear, when a section, for instance, says an inspector can go, where he expects there's something regulated by the Act, that's completely allowed, and inspect documents and just basically check for compliance. So when we look, at the first part of this, section, 20 sub 1, where they can enter onto the property,
Yes.
that's valid, where they can, examine and test things. In my opinion, that would be valid administrative law, that it's very well accepted that they can go onto commercial premises, and they can even go up to a home. Let's say you had a home-based business
Right.
with consumer product. So you're allowed to do that, and that's a given. Nobody's going to charge somebody for going into a shopping mall because you're not trespassing. Everyone's allowed to actually go into a mall. There's an implied invitation. So when I read 20 sub 4, it really stuck out to me as to, well, why do they need that there? Being that, courts accept inspectors' rights to go onto property. That's already set out, actually in a very common way. Like this first part of section 20 doesn't alarm me at all. I see a pattern with other acts, but bang, this 20 sub 4 jumped out, and it's not limited to commercial premises. It's anything, and it's actually on, the private property that I think that it's designed for, because it's, unless you're jumping into somebody's storage yard at
Well,
night.
to go into a private property, they need consent or they need a warrant. Yes, if you go into somebody's house, you need a warrant or
No,
consent.
you said private property.
Well, property.
Wait a minute,
Private
let's-
property. A shopping mall is private property.
No.
shopping mall is private
Senator,
property.
let's keep this to questions to the
Fine.
witness, please.
But I guess what
And
you're...
give him a chance to respond, too.
I am, but I guess it just... We disagree, so...
Yeah.
No,
So
I
I don't understand what you're saying, I guess.
Yeah, so the way the law of trespass works is we start with the premise that we've got absolute right to private enjoyment of our property, but we do, for instance, give that up in certain